Welcome, and for those who don't know, I'm Marina, and I've been researching the art of borrowed storytelling from ancient myth, how it's used in today's storytelling with animation, live action, and comic books. So let's have a quick look at the agenda. There'll be an introduction, then we'll look at storytelling, we'll look at Marvel Studios and Marvel's take on mythology, then we'll look at the Egyptian mythology and their storytelling, and we'll move over to DC's creators and their mythology. We'll look specifically at Hermes and the Flash, and then we'll look at storytelling and its tough topics, heroes and villains, animation's place in all of this, The Simpsons and the Odyssey, public domain stories, and then we'll be wrapping it up. So the focus of my research was one question: how much of the divine ancient storytelling can we sneak into our pop culture stories before gods cry theft and take us to court on the grounds of copyright? My question stems from watching Marvel, DC and Matt Groenenberg, the creator of The Simpsons, taking snippets of the ancient mythologies and adapting them to today's audience. This quotation from the Centre of Excellence: Greek myths are not only rooted but have helped shape modern thinking in important ways. Their mythic nature does not take away from the fact they contain important morals and teachings. They are relevant now as they were thousands of years ago. But what is a myth, and why is it important? So myths are defined as a narrative, or something akin to a narrative, that a group of people or individuals use to make sense of the world around them. So we get to see this in religion, and we get to see this in philosophy, and then we get to see this in ancient mythologies. We see these stories affecting populations through generations and generations of time. But we'll come back to this later on in the presentation. So with storytelling, we could go as far back into history as reading drawings off cave walls. But instead today we're going to look at this quote: "Those who tell the stories rule the world." This quotation from Margolis is also used as a Native American proverb. But what does it mean? Well, this quotation suggests that storytelling holds an immense power and influence over society. It implies that those who have the ability to shape and control narrative wield significant authority and control over people's perceptions, beliefs, and actions. We see this a bit with religion, we see this a bit through mythology as well. In essence, storytelling is seen as a means of shaping culture, shaping societal norms, and influencing public opinion. Throughout history, storytellers, whether through oral traditions, literature, film, or other mediums, have played crucial roles in demonstrating information, transmitting cultural values, and shaping collective consciousness. This phrasing highlights the importance of narratives in shaping our understanding in the world. This also highlights the responsibility that storytellers carry in shaping the narratives that define our societies. It suggests that those who have control over storytelling have the power to shape the course of history and influence the direction of society. The actual power in storytelling lies in the ability to engage emotion and convey messages and shape perceptions. And this is in a way that would resonate deeply with the audience, usually by incorporating today's culture throughout the story in order to make it relatable. So moving on from Marvel Studios, we find this quote that's not entirely accurate. Stan Lee says, "I chose the Norse gods because I felt people were less familiar with them than with the Greek or the Roman gods." 2011. Stan Lee in fact chose all the mythologies to place into his storytelling in time, but a main base was Norse stories. Old stories of ancient gods were reborn as misunderstood anti-heroes, cosmic deities, and heroic venturers, in vibrant worlds of comic books where pen and paper meet imagination. The dynamic, ever-adapting stories of that superheroes and the timeless legends of the past dance together, connecting mythology and storytelling. This massive comic book company, first called Timely Publications, has its origins in the imaginations of artists such as Steve Ditko, Jack Kirby, and Stan Lee. So actually in my research I found that Marvel used quite a lot of mythologies. It was well-rounded, it was kind of close to being a whole world view of mythology, but I just found that Marvel used it in a really teasing ways. They used little nuggets of the mythology. They didn't stick closely to the mythology. So let's have a closer look at how they used the mythology. Within these two quotes, one directly from Marvel and one directly about Zeus as a god, we can see that parts of Norse mythology is getting brought in here with statements about Odin from Marvel there, and then Gaia, that's a Greek mythology, she's the goddess of the earth. So again, we're getting a good fine mix through Marvel there. The juxtaposition highlights how Marvel and traditional mythology depict these characters differently. So while Marvel presents Thor as a prince with divine heritage, Zelasco emphasises Zeus's role as a mighty god governing over natural forces, again emphasising that natural spin that Marvel puts on all of its work. So moving on to Egyptian mythology and Marvel's storytelling, we get this quote from Film Speak in 2022, where, to summarise, he basically says that unless it's been the Egyptian mythology, MCU hasn't really stuck closely to the mythologies, where in Egyptian mythology we find quite a lot of very close information. So we're introduced to Egyptian gods and deities, we're introduced to what their tasks are within that. You could watch Moon Knight not knowing anything about Egyptian mythology and come out of watching Moon Knight knowing more about Egyptian mythology. It's that close. And while sticking that closely to the Egyptian mythology and giving that much information, they still have time to add into the storyline things like personal growth and mental health and personal problems and mysticism. Again, creating that connection with the viewer, creating that memory, and leaving a lasting story. So moving on to DC's creations and how they use mythology. Much like Marvel, they've reimagined the ancient myths. And much like Marvel, they seem to have used a couple of different myths. DC are more focused on Greek and Roman gods. We see this with the Olympians. And again, we get to see that use of humour in today's culture entwined through it so that the viewer's more interested, more invested. So we're moving on to DC's version of The Flash, which is closely based on Hermes, the Greek god. We get this quotation from Cartwright from 2019. Famous for his diplomatic skills, Hermes was regarded as a patron of language and rhetoric, and we do get the chance to see this within The Flash and DC's universe. So ultimately, my conclusion on The Flash was that while both The Flash and Hermes do have certain similarities, such as their extraordinary speed and service to the gods, and even some of their uniforms, such as sandals and headwear, they do have notable differences, which I've interpreted as ultimately taking a part of the mythology and then adapting it to today's culture. Again, ultimately, DC's portrayal of the Flash lacks some of the more deeper aspects associated with Hermes and these ancient myths, such as his enigmatic depths and trickster nature. Despite their similarities, in analysis implies that the Flash's character does not fully capture the essence of Hermes. It has depicted the ancient mythology, but again, it's just snippets, just tasters. So moving on to storytelling, addressing the tough topics, within my research, the most I saw of this was with Moon Knight, that addressing the split personality and mental health issues and different depictions of mental health homes and things like that. This one in my research was most prevalent for addressing those tough topics while still staying closely kind of to the Egyptian mythology in this case. But throughout my time as a fan of Marvel and DC, I've found other characters, other stories that have been really good at addressing those tough topics, such as X-Men representing that discrimination and how people who are different are treated differently. And Spider-Man with the reflecting how to balance personal challenges with responsibilities. You get Batman who addresses loss, and Superman who deals with weaknesses despite being such a massive power. We deal with Iron Man, Tony Stark, who deals with issues of addiction and trauma, as well as Wonder Woman, who deals with challenges of identity. Throughout my research, I emphasise how these narratives provide means for audiences, including myself, to confront real-world issues through these fantastical settings, offering insights into resilience and trauma processing, as well as personal growth. By weaving themes of adversity and triumph into their stories, superheroes offer all of us a therapeutic lens through which we can explore and process any of our own experiences, demonstrating the profound impact of mythology and contemporary fiction in our understanding of coping with difficult topics. So moving on to heroes and villains, I thought it important to talk about them because they oppose each other in the story and keep each other going usually. With the quotation above, we see that they're actually embedded in culture, and it's more of a reflection on the world that we live in than anything else. Heroes and villains play a pivotal role in any storytelling as they embody human qualities, social values, and offer insights to mortality, adversity, and personal growth while exploring their own interactions. Again, this dynamic between the two keeps the story going. So moving on to animation's place and all of that, relating it back to my personal studio practice, we find animation's just another vehicle for storytelling, but it's more diverse. You can give it to children, you can feed it to adults. It's got less barriers than, say, a comic book would have, and more visual leeway than reality would have. I found that animation was really dynamic in contemporary storytelling, from everything from hand-drawn animation, 2D animation to CGI animation. We find these stories enhanced through the medium of animation. So a really good example of that would be the Odyssey through the lens of The Simpsons. The episode was called Tales of the Public Domain. This was the first time I'd heard about the public domain, and it sent me on a lot of research that you'll hear about at the end. But to summarise what I found out about this, Matt Groening pretty much did the same thing that Marvel did and DC, in that they took parts of the mythology and they didn't stick as closely to it, but they did use humour and very human experiences in order to relate the character to the viewer, which does seem to be a template of use if you're using these public domain stories. So in this episode we encounter Homer as Asidious, who's navigating the Trojan War while encountering gods. And then the rest of the episode goes from that to Joan of Arc and a few other public domain stories, but really left me with the question, what's the public domain? And I found that the public domain was full of stories of myths, stories that people couldn't really claim, but it's more than that. It's creative work that has no exclusive intellectual property, which covers poetry, music, art, as well as storytelling, which kind of resolves the essay, to be honest, realising that the vast catalogue of mythologies are owned by public and that we can all just add away to them or change them. Stands as an unrestricted resource available for universal utilisation. Because these stories are owned by the public and anyone can use them, the real problem that you've got when using them is making them unique to yourself, making the narratives relate to the audience, and how we do that, how we adapt the story and visualise it as well. So moving on to the conclusion, we come back to my main question. How much of the divine ancient storytelling can we sneak into our pop culture stories before gods cry theft and take us to court on the grounds of copyright? And due to the public domain, it turns out we can take as much of the stories as we want, as long as we're respectful and adapt it to today's audience and keep it exciting. We've got full leeway on the stories. I did, however, find a template of using today's pop culture loosely alongside mental health and humanising the characters to keep them relatable to today's viewer. I also found a template of not using all the mythology directly. I found a template of mixing the mythologies and then using each mythology quite loosely in order to just hint towards it, as opposed to like a direct retelling. I found that retelling these ancient myths was offering rich stories that resonate across cultures. And again, relearning that importance of storytelling and how it embeds in cultures and how it affects societies. So I guess my conclusion is that I can use any of the public domain stories as long as I adapt them, and that storytelling is extremely important to culture, to society, and how people function. Thank you for your time, and I'll be open to any questions.